On the afternoon of the 4th of September, 2022, fighter jets from 4 European nations took turns flying alongside a small private aircraft as it crossed the sky above the continent, and the pilots who looked into its cockpit saw no one moving inside. The aircraft, a business jet bound from southern Spain to Germany, had climbed to its cruising altitude and locked onto its course, and it held that course with an eerie, machine-like steadiness, hour after hour, ignoring every attempt to raise it on the radio. It flew over its destination without descending. It crossed an international border, then another, trailed by military jets whose pilots could only watch, helpless, unable to do anything but follow. And then, far out over the Baltic Sea, its fuel finally exhausted, the aircraft slowed, dropped, and spiraled down into the water, killing the 4 people aboard. But those 4 people had not been alive to feel the fall. They had lost consciousness hours earlier, shortly after takeoff, victims of a silent, painless killer that had crept into the cabin without a sound and taken them all before they understood what was happening. This is the story of the Baltic Sea ghost flight, and of one of the most insidious dangers in all of aviation, the quiet failure that steals a crew's awareness before it steals their lives. On the 4th of September, 2022, a Cessna 551 Citation II business jet, chartered for a flight from Jerez in southern Spain to Cologne in Germany, crashed into the Baltic Sea off the coast of Latvia after flying for hours across Europe with no one at the controls, a so-called ghost flight that ended only when the aircraft ran out of fuel and spiraled into the sea. All 4 people aboard were killed. Shortly after takeoff, the pilot had reported a problem with the cabin pressure and requested to descend. Moments later, contact was lost, and it was never regained. The aircraft, on autopilot, climbed to and held its assigned altitude of 36,000 feet, flew past its destination without any attempt to land, and continued on a straight northeasterly course out over the sea, shadowed for much of its journey by military fighter jets scrambled from several nations, whose pilots reported that they could see no one moving in the cockpit. The grim explanation, confirmed by the subsequent investigation, was a loss of cabin pressurization that had caused everyone aboard to lose consciousness from lack of oxygen, a condition known as hypoxia, leaving the aircraft to fly on, pilotless, until its fuel was gone. This is the story of how a routine flight became a ghost, of the silent killer that took its occupants, and of why this particular danger is one of the most feared in aviation, because it disables the very people who might have saved themselves, quietly, and often before they even realize they are in danger. To understand this accident, we have to understand 3 things: the aircraft and the people aboard, the invisible danger that overcame them, and the strange, haunting journey of the ghost flight itself. Let us begin with the flight. The aircraft was a Cessna 551 Citation II, a small twin-engine business jet, a compact, widely used private jet of a classic design, powered by 2 engines mounted at the rear of the fuselage. It was not a new aircraft. Built in 1979, it was 43 years old at the time of the accident, though age alone does not make an aircraft unsafe, provided it is properly maintained. Notably, the aircraft was certified for single-pilot operation, meaning it was legal and normal for it to be flown by just one pilot, without a co-pilot beside them. This is a common and accepted arrangement for smaller business jets, but it carries an inherent vulnerability that would prove central to this tragedy. If that single pilot is incapacitated, there is no second pilot to take over. The aircraft was also, as is common for jets of its size and vintage, not fitted with a flight data recorder, the device that logs an aircraft's movements and systems, a fact that would shape the investigation, forcing it to rely on radar data, radio recordings, the observations of the intercepting fighter pilots, and the physical evidence recovered from the sea. Aboard were 4 people, and out of respect for them and for those who grieved them, this account will speak of them with care. For this was not only an aviation disaster but a family tragedy. The pilot was a German businessman, flying with his wife, his adult daughter, who was herself a licensed pilot, and his daughter's partner. They were a family, traveling together, and they died together, overcome by the same silent failure, without warning and without any chance to save themselves. There is a particular poignancy in the presence of a second qualified pilot aboard, the daughter, who, under any other circumstance, might have been able to help. But the nature of this emergency was such that it disabled everyone aboard at essentially the same time, leaving no one, qualified or not, in a condition to act. The loss of an entire family in a single aircraft is among the most heartbreaking forms these tragedies take, and it is worth holding that human reality in mind as we turn to the technical story of what happened and why. The story of this accident is above all the story of a single insidious danger, and to understand the ghost flight, we must first understand the killer that created it, the loss of cabin pressure at high altitude, and the hypoxia that follows. Every aircraft that flies at high altitude faces a fundamental problem. The air up there is too thin to breathe. At the altitudes where jets cruise, here 36,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure is so low that a human being exposed to it would lose consciousness within a very short time and die not long after. To make high-altitude flight possible, aircraft cabins are pressurized. Air is pumped into the sealed cabin to maintain a pressure far higher than that outside, roughly equivalent to the pressure at a modest altitude of a few thousand feet, where people can breathe normally. This pressurization system is what keeps everyone aboard alive, and it works so reliably and so invisibly that passengers and crew rarely give it a thought. But if that system fails, if the cabin loses its pressure, whether suddenly or gradually, the air inside becomes as thin as the air outside, and everyone aboard is exposed to an environment that the human body cannot tolerate. What follows is hypoxia, a state of oxygen starvation that impairs the brain and body, and, if not corrected, leads to unconsciousness and death. What makes hypoxia so uniquely dangerous, and what makes it the silent killer at the heart of this story, is the insidious way it affects the mind. One might imagine that a person starved of oxygen would feel a desperate, unmistakable urge to breathe, a clear alarm compelling them to act. But that is not how hypoxia works. Its onset is often subtle and painless, and, most treacherously, it impairs judgment and self-awareness among the very first faculties it degrades. A person becoming hypoxic may feel not panic but a strange euphoria, a dreamy sense of well-being. They may become confused, slow, and unable to think clearly, all while feeling that everything is fine. They lose the ability to recognize their own impairment, to understand that they are in danger and must act, precisely at the moment when quick, correct action is essential. This is why hypoxia has killed so many. Not because its victims lack the means to save themselves, but because the condition robbed them of the awareness that they needed to. And at high altitude, there is very little time. The period during which a person can still act usefully after being deprived of oxygen, the time of useful consciousness, shrinks dramatically as altitude increases. At 36,000 feet, following a significant loss of pressure, that window may be as short as a matter of seconds to a minute or so. In that brief, narrowing window, a pilot must recognize what is happening, despite the condition actively clouding their judgment, and take immediate, specific action, or they will slip into unconsciousness with the aircraft still flying. This is why the procedures for a loss of cabin pressure are drilled into pilots as among the most time-critical of all emergencies, to be executed immediately and from memory. The first and most vital action is to don an oxygen mask without delay, before doing anything else, because oxygen is the one thing that stops the clock, restoring the pilot's ability to think and act. Only with oxygen secured can the pilot then begin an emergency descent, bringing the aircraft down rapidly to an altitude where the air is thick enough to breathe without a mask. The entire philosophy of these procedures rests on speed and on the recognition that the pilot's own mind is under attack. The mask goes on first, immediately, on the very first suspicion of a pressure problem, because to delay even slightly is to risk losing the clarity of thought required to act at all. The tragedy of hypoxia accidents is that this narrow, unforgiving window is so easily missed, and once it closes, once the crew has lapsed into unconsciousness, there is no one left to save the aircraft. Now we can follow the ghost flight itself. The Cessna took off from Jerez in the early afternoon and began to climb toward its cruising altitude. Shortly after takeoff, the pilot radioed air traffic control to report a problem with the cabin pressure and to request a descent, the correct instinct, an attempt to get the aircraft down to a safe altitude. But it was already too late, or nearly so. Moments after that transmission, contact with the aircraft was lost, and it would never be regained. Whatever was happening inside the cabin had, in those few moments, overtaken the pilot before the descent could be carried out. The aircraft, under the control of its autopilot, continued to climb to its assigned altitude of 36,000 feet, leveled off, and flew on, straight, steady, and silent, on the course its navigation system had been given. Inside, the investigation would later confirm, the pilot and all aboard had lost consciousness from the lack of oxygen. The machine flew on perfectly. The people within it could no longer respond. As the silent aircraft crossed into French airspace, still not answering any radio calls, the alarm spread through the air traffic and military systems of Europe. Fighter jets were scrambled to intercept it. First French Rafales, which drew alongside the Cessna to see what was wrong. Their pilots looked into the cockpit and reported what would become the haunting signature of this flight. They could see no one moving inside. The Cessna flew on, holding its altitude and heading, and the French jets escorted it across France until, near Cologne, German Eurofighters took over the vigil. This was the aircraft's destination, the airport it had been bound for, and here, had anyone been at the controls, it would have begun its descent to land. It did not. It flew straight over Cologne at 36,000 feet, without the slightest deviation, and continued on its northeasterly course, out over northern Germany and toward the Baltic Sea. The ghost flight had passed the one place it was meant to stop, and flown on into the emptiness beyond. For nearly 2 more hours, the Cessna continued out over the Baltic, covering more than 1,000 kilometers of open sea, trailed and observed by military aircraft that could do nothing but follow. German jets broke away near the island of Rügen. The aircraft flew on south of Gotland and toward the Gulf of Riga, where a Danish F-16 took up the escort. The Danish pilots, too, confirmed the terrible truth. No one was visible in the cockpit. There was nothing anyone could do. A pilotless aircraft at altitude cannot be brought down safely by those around it. It can only be watched. And so the world's fighter pilots became witnesses, flying alongside a small jet carrying 4 people who were beyond all help, waiting for the inevitable moment when the fuel would run out. That moment came far out over the sea, off the Latvian coast near the port of Ventspils. As the last of its fuel was exhausted, the engines fell silent, and the aircraft, with no one to control it, lost speed and lift, dropped its nose, and spiraled down out of the sky, plunging into the Baltic Sea. The Danish pilots watched it fall. All 4 people aboard were killed on impact. Though they had, mercifully, been unconscious and unaware for hours, the ghost flight was over. There is a further dimension to the ghost flight that deserves mention, because it shaped the response and heightened the tension of those hours, the geopolitical context in which it unfolded. This was September 2022, and the skies over the Baltic were among the most sensitive in the world. A region ringed by NATO members and bordering Russian territory, patrolled continuously under a standing air policing mission precisely because of the risk that any unidentified or unresponsive aircraft might represent a threat. An aircraft flying erratically, ignoring all radio calls, deviating from expectations, and heading out across this contested sea was exactly the kind of event that the region's air defenses were built to catch. This is part of why fighter jets from multiple nations were scrambled so readily, not only out of concern for the aircraft and its occupants, but because an unresponsive aircraft in that airspace, at that moment in history, could not be assumed to be harmless until it was understood. The interceptions confirmed quickly that this was no deliberate act but a stricken flight with an incapacitated crew. But the readiness with which the aircraft was met speaks to how seriously such an anomaly is taken. And it underscored again the essential helplessness at the heart of the story. Even with the full weight of NATO air power brought to bear, aware of the aircraft and shadowing it every mile, there was simply nothing that could be done to bring it down safely. The option of destroying it, whatever the circumstances, would do nothing to save the souls aboard and would only bring the wreckage down elsewhere. And so the only course was to watch, and to wait, and to follow the ghost to its end. The investigation into the crash was taken over by the German Federal Bureau of Aircraft Accident Investigation, the country's air safety authority, and it faced the particular challenge posed by the absence of a flight data recorder and by the aircraft's resting place at the bottom of the sea. Wreckage, including seats, and the remains of those aboard were recovered from the seabed, which lay at a depth of around 60 meters. Working from the radar track of the flight, the recordings of the pilot's radio transmissions, the consistent testimony of the intercepting fighter pilots who saw no movement in the cockpit, and the physical evidence, investigators pieced together what had happened. The provisional findings were clear and consistent with everything observed. Shortly after the pilot reported the cabin pressure problem and asked to descend, everyone aboard lost consciousness, and the aircraft flew on under autopilot until its fuel was exhausted. The official conclusion reported afterward attributed the deaths to a lack of oxygen following the loss of cabin pressurization. The ghost flight was not a mystery of intent or malice, nor of a catastrophic mechanical breakup. It was the working out, across the skies of Europe, of a decompression that had silently incapacitated everyone aboard in its first moments. It is worth dwelling on the special vulnerability created by single-pilot operation, because it is one of the quiet lessons of this accident. In an airliner with two pilots, there is a critical layer of redundancy against exactly this kind of event. Procedures and training are built around the idea that if one pilot becomes incapacitated, the other can take over, don their own mask, and bring the aircraft down. Even then, a rapid or insidious decompression is dangerous, but the presence of a second, independent pilot dramatically improves the odds that someone will recognize the problem and act in time. In a single-pilot aircraft, that layer does not exist. The one pilot is the sole line of defense, and if they are overcome, especially by a condition like hypoxia that attacks their judgment first, there is no backup, no one else trained and positioned to save the flight. Poignantly, this aircraft did carry a second licensed pilot, the daughter, but she was a passenger, not in the flying seat, not necessarily aware of the developing emergency until it was too late for anyone and subject to the same oxygen starvation as everyone else. The tragedy underscores why single-pilot operation, though legal and common, carries an irreducible risk. It places the entire safety of the flight on the continued capacity of one human being, in an environment where that capacity can be silently taken away. The manner in which a cabin loses its pressure matters a great deal, and it points to why this accident, and others like it, can be so deadly. A decompression can be explosive and sudden, a rapid, unmistakable event with a bang, a rush of air, fog in the cabin, and immediate awareness that something is catastrophically wrong. Such an event, for all its violence, at least announces itself. But a decompression can also be slow and insidious. A gradual leak, a pressurization system quietly failing to keep up, the cabin altitude creeping upward so slowly that no alarm registers in the mind of the crew until hypoxia has already begun to cloud their judgment. This slow kind is, in some ways, the more dangerous, because it gives no dramatic cue to trigger the immediate life-saving response. By the time anything feels wrong, the insidious impairment of hypoxia may already have taken hold, and with it the crew's ability to recognize and address the problem. Whatever the precise nature of the pressure failure aboard the Cessna, the outcome bore the terrible signature of hypoxia. A crew overtaken so quickly and so quietly that, despite the pilot's initial recognition that something was wrong with the cabin pressure, unconsciousness came before the aircraft could be brought down to safety. This accident sits within a grim lineage of hypoxia disasters that have haunted aviation, and though each is distinct, they share the same essential and chilling character. In the most catastrophic such accidents, a large airliner has been lost with everyone aboard after a pressurization failure incapacitated the crew, the aircraft flying on autopilot until fuel exhaustion, the same pattern, on a larger scale, that played out over the Baltic. In another, a business jet carrying a well-known passenger crossed an entire country on autopilot, trailed by fighter jets, before crashing when its fuel ran out, its occupants long since overcome. The recurrence of this pattern, the pilotless aircraft, the silent cockpit, the helpless military escort, the flight continuing until the fuel is gone, is precisely what makes hypoxia such a feared adversary. It produces not a dramatic struggle, but an eerie, prolonged inevitability. An aircraft flying on, perfectly under control of its machinery, and utterly beyond the control of the dead or unconscious souls aboard. The Baltic ghost flight is the latest chapter in this dark history, and it carries the same lesson each of the others did, that the loss of cabin pressure and the hypoxia it brings must be treated with the utmost speed and seriousness, because the danger lies not only in the thin air itself, but in the way it disarms the very people who must respond to it. It is worth understanding more deeply why human beings are so poorly equipped to save themselves from this particular danger, because the answer reveals something profound about the limits of our own perception. With most threats, the body provides a clear and insistent warning: pain, breathlessness, fear, an unmistakable signal that compels action. Hypoxia provides no such reliable alarm. The sensation of needing to breathe is driven not primarily by a lack of oxygen, but by a buildup of carbon dioxide. And in some kinds of decompression, a person can be dangerously starved of oxygen while feeling little of the air hunger that would otherwise warn them. Worse, the brain regions responsible for higher judgment, self-monitoring, and the recognition of danger are among the first to be impaired, so the hypoxic mind loses the very capacity it would need to diagnose its own condition. The result is a person who is becoming incapacitated while sincerely believing they are fine, sometimes even cheerfully so. This is why pilots who fly at high altitude are in many programs deliberately exposed to controlled hypoxia in an altitude chamber during training, to feel, in a safe setting, the specific and personal way their own mind fails under oxygen starvation, so that they might recognize the subtle signs in themselves before it is too late. The experience is sobering precisely because the impairment is so gentle, so unalarming, so easy to miss. Against a threat that disables perception itself, the only reliable defense is a trained, almost reflexive response that does not depend on the victim correctly judging their situation. The mask reached for at the first hint automatically, before the mind that would make the decision can be compromised. The lessons of the Baltic ghost flight are, in one sense, lessons the aviation world already knew, but which every such tragedy renders newly urgent. The first and most fundamental concerns the response to any hint of a pressurization problem. It must be immediate, instinctive, and uncompromising. The oxygen mask goes on at the very first suspicion, before diagnosis, before troubleshooting, before anything else. Because oxygen is the one thing that preserves the crew's ability to do everything else, and because the window in which they can act is so terrifyingly short. Pilots are trained to treat a pressurization warning not as a problem to be analyzed, but as an immediate threat to their own consciousness, to be met by reaching for oxygen first and thinking second. The Cessna's pilot recognized a pressure problem and did the right thing in requesting a descent, but the essence of the hypoxia threat is that recognition and intention are not enough if the mask does not go on fast enough, because the condition can close the window before the plan can be carried out. The second lesson concerns the systems that warn of and defend against this danger. Modern aircraft carry cabin altitude warnings designed to alert the crew to a loss of pressure before hypoxia sets in, and the reliability, clarity, and urgency of those warnings is critical. For a warning that comes too late or is too easily missed or misunderstood is precisely what allows a slow decompression to become fatal. There is a continual effort in aviation to improve these systems, to ensure that a dangerous loss of cabin pressure announces itself unmistakably and early, while there is still time to act. And the third lesson returns to single-pilot operation and the question of redundancy, the recognition that when a single individual is the sole safeguard of a flight, the consequences of their incapacitation are absolute, and that this risk must be weighed seriously, particularly for the kind of insidious, awareness-destroying emergencies against which a lone pilot is least able to defend. None of these lessons is new, but they are written again each time in the record of flights like this one. It is important, in telling this story, to be clear about where responsibility lies, and to be fair to the pilot, who was also a victim. It would be a profound mistake to see in this accident any failure of will or competence on his part. Hypoxia is not defeated by courage or skill. It is a physiological assault that disables judgment and consciousness with a speed and subtlety that can overcome even the most capable and experienced aviator. The pilot recognized that something was wrong and reached for the correct solution, requesting a descent. That the condition overtook him before he could complete it is a testament to the ferocity of the threat, not to any shortcoming of his own. He, his wife, his daughter, and her partner were the victims of a silent failure that gave them almost no chance. A family overtaken together, without pain and without warning, in the thin air 5 miles above the earth. To understand this accident is not to assign blame, but to grasp the nature of a danger that spares no one on the basis of merit, and to renew our respect for how quickly and quietly it can strike. There is something uniquely haunting about the ghost flight, an image that lingers precisely because of its stillness. There was no fireball in the sky, no frantic mayday, no desperate battle with a crippled machine. There was only a small aircraft, flying on with perfect mechanical composure, carrying 4 people who were already beyond reach, while the fighter pilots of one nation after another drew alongside, looked into the silent cockpit, and understood that there was nothing to be done. It is a tableau of technological capability rendered helpless by human vulnerability. The most advanced military aircraft in the world, flying wingtip to wingtip with a doomed private jet, able to see everything and change nothing. And it is a reminder of the strange, specific horror of hypoxia, that it can turn a flight into a ghost, an aircraft into a tomb moving serenely through the sky, hours before it finally comes to rest. The Baltic Sea ghost flight asks us to remember the silent killer that made it, and to treat the invisible danger of the thin air with the fear and the readiness it demands. 4 people took off from Spain on a September afternoon, bound for home, and never landed, carried on across Europe and out over the Baltic by an aircraft that flew flawlessly while they lay unconscious within it, until the fuel ran dry and the sea took them. There was no failure of the machine in the end, and no failure of the pilot's courage or intent. There was only the thin, deadly air of high altitude, let into the cabin by a failure of pressure, and the silent, merciless efficiency with which it stole first their awareness and then their lives. The lasting lesson is one of the oldest and hardest in aviation, that at altitude, the air itself is the enemy, held at bay only by a system that must never fail unnoticed, and a crew that must never delay in reaching for oxygen, because the danger of hypoxia is not merely that it can kill, but that it kills the very awareness that might have saved you quietly, and before you know that you are in danger at all. 4 people were lost to that silence over the Baltic Sea. May the lesson of their loss help ensure that others hear the warning in time.